In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The Thursday after Trinity Sunday, which was this Thursday of this week, is the festival of Corpus Christi. And owing to the fact that on a weekday we are all busy with various things, we usually celebrate it at the present time and on the Sunday thereafter. The festival of Corpus Christi is originated in the 1100s, or 1200s, right around there on the edge of the two, if I'm not mistaken, in that period when a strange sort of mystical wave came over Western Christendom. That was the time when the Cathars were active in the south of France, and all sorts of really interesting and profoundly involved mystics arose in the body of the Catholic Church as well. Hildegard of Bingen was around that time, Mechtild of Magdeburg, and some of the other, the male Rhineland mystics, and one of around that same time in what is now the country of Belgium, Saint Juliana, as she came to be known later on, of Liège or Lüttich, depending on which language you prefer, was responsible for instituting the festival of Corpus Christi. She was a visionary nun who had a vision, and it was, so we are told, it was the full moon was in the sky, and he came out and looked at the moon, and the full moon changed in her inner vision to the sacred host of the Eucharist, and she was told by the voice that she interpreted as that of the Lord Christ, that a new festival specifically devoted to the Holy Eucharist should be instituted, at which time the sacred bread, the Holy Sacrament of the altar, should be taken in procession out of the church and to the limits of the cities, and its blessing being given to the countryside outside, and in such a way that all the people who were in the city or on the periphery of the city could be there and view the sacrament and worship for it. Now you need to sort of keep in mind that this was, of course, also the era of the great Gothic cathedrals and similar churches, which, if you have any acquaintance with them at all, you will know are magnificent and majestic, huge structures. But let's say if you come into, I don't know, the cathedral at Aachen or any of the great cathedrals, the altar where the Holy Eucharist is celebrated is way over there. But you can see it about this way if your eyes are good. And so, let's say, a lot of people, unless they were taking communion and so forth, which usually only occurred at Easter time, they were not in close proximity to the sacrament. And so this festival has, let's say, remedied that, and it first got started in the Diocese of Liège, where I actually lived for close to a year once. It's a nice place. It's in the Wallonie part of Belgium, not very far from the place where the Battle of the Bulge was fought in World War II, for instance, in the Ardennes Mountains, and so the new festival then was for that purpose, and it became very popular. It spread all over Western Christendom and was declared an official holiday by the popes and ever after celebrated with great solemnity right to the present time. I haven't seen it, but I understand that there was a very large and very spectacular procession this Thursday in Rome, which is nice to see. And so let's see what kind of meaning sort of within the interpretive framework of our tradition can be attached to this holiday. Well, obviously the sort of the one that is right at the surface is that the Holy Eucharist, the bread and the wine, and of course the bread was also always regarded as containing, because it's the body. The body contains the blood, so you don't always have to have both, the wine and the bread substitutes for the wine. But interestingly enough, the wine does not substitute for the body. In any event, that this is a very great and sacred thing, and it's not just some sort of an old custom that we go through and march up to the communion, to take it, as an old priest in Central California once told me with considerable sorrow in his voice, that he was always unhappy when the nuns were herding up the little children to communion, telling them in a loud voice, "Don't throw the baby Jesus." Apparently he couldn't stop them from this curious custom that they had adopted. But that is really something very, very precious and tremendously helpful, has been bequeathed to us. And we have the various evidence of it, of how that was instituted from the Last Supper, and of course until Corpus Christi, the principal commemoration of the Last Supper, the institution of the Holy Eucharist, was celebrated only on Maundy Thursday, which it still is, because that is the commemoration of the Last Supper. And so that's the first meaning. We have something very important here. Now, of course, it's one of these truly Gnostic things that we can't explain it. We don't theorize about it, but I think, at least I do, and I do trust that a great many of you do, value this very greatly. That is something that we received, and that in a mysterious interior way nourishes our inner being, and that it really is, as it has been poetically called, the bread of the angels and the lifeblood of the universe. Now, of course, the sort of the trivial lesser mind of our human nature will say, well, all right, I take the communion and I go back to my seat and I don't really feel anything. Well, not everything important that happens to us is felt at the time very dramatically. I could recount ad infinitum and probably ad nauseam, of all kinds of incidents in my life, which at the time they happened, well, just was something that happened, But its importance, its grace, its power, really only revealed itself to me in various ways later on. And so it is with this. Now, of course, there are things in the world that one can do, that one can partake of if one wishes, that have pretty immediate dramatic effects. Now, you see, if we were partaking of a decent dose of LSD, I'm sure you would feel something right away. But then depending on your situation and how prepared you are and so forth, what you feel might not be even all that pleasant. I mean, after all, there are such things as that were called in the blessed 60s, bad trips. So, there are some things that are dramatic, but not necessarily all that sacred and all that important, depending on the circumstance. On the other hand, there are means of grace which are very soft, they are very unobtrusive, they are very undramatic, but they are nevertheless a very great help to the human soul. And it's whether we feel anything or not, because this feeling element is largely of the emotional nature, and that might not be the part of our being that is being affected by this mystery. And so this is something that we need to keep in mind. But there are, as always, in the worldview of the Gnosis, there are other aspects and other layers of meaning. And one of them that is no doubt metaphorical, but that perhaps might be helpful to us at this time, is that the Corpus Christi festival brings to our attention that the sacred thing that we have deeply within ourselves, whether we have taken communion that day or not, the Christ in us, the hope of glory, rests within the tabernacle of our own nature, just like the Holy Sacrament rests within the tabernacle of the altar, that this sacred thing ought not to be just locked up deeply within ourselves, but that we should promote to the extent of our ability it coming forth and sanctifying the rest of our lives and the rest of our activities. Now we might say, oh dear, I mean, I do so many things during the day that by its very nature, by their very nature are either trivial or maybe even not particularly sacred. So, how can I do that? Yet I think it can be done. I think if we make a certain internal resolutions and say, look, today I want the sacred to manifest in my life. That doesn't mean that I will become an image in a stained glass window. It would be rather boring, although colorful. But it means that I want my actions, I want my thoughts, I want the things that I do during the day to contain some of that sacredness. We have in the Gospel of Thomas, we have the famous saying wherein Jesus says, raise the stone and thou shalt find me, cleave the wood and I am there, which was actually a saying that was available prior to the discovery of Nachamadi, because it was also part of some fragments that were found earlier on. If you want the name of it, was the Oxyrhynchus papyrus. It sounds so archetypal. But so what is really meant there again? It doesn't mean that a stone, a piece of wood, is Christ. No, divine presence is everywhere. It's the secret of omnipresence, and perhaps more than that. But it means that if we are conscious of it, then the divine is very powerfully and effectively present everywhere. And so we should be a little bit conscious. And we should it's not a great big deal that takes, I don't know, many hours of prayer and fasting, which is something I never liked, and things of that sort. But an ongoing, steady act of our will. Let the Holy One be present in what I do. I don't want to be without it. Let it come. And I go forth. Let the presence be there. And if we keep that as a sort of determination of our consciousness, then it will be there. And so this will be sort of the concomitant of the story of taking the Blessed Sacrament out of the church, out from where it is guarded, and let the rest of our lives, with its joys and sorrows and with its shortcomings and with its virtues, be there and contemplate it and receive its blessing. Because that is really what is the ultimately desirable condition. It has been called the sacrament of life. When a great deal of our lives, I don't want to be too grandiloquent here and say that it's all of our lives, but a great deal of our lives becomes sacred, becomes consecrated. And when that indeed happens, then there is so much more light of understanding, light of consciousness, light of goodness in our lives, which we certainly need. And again, we have to be careful. We are not talking here about intellectual understanding of concepts and precepts. It comes right down to it. I'll make a sort of a rash statement. I think the Christ within us couldn't care less about our concepts and our precepts. Why? Because they're really not important. This is the great problem. The churches have turned the order around, and the important thing is what you believe. Well, people can believe all kinds of things. I could pinpoint some radio programs to you, because I'm still a great radio buff, when people sort of are encouraged to spout their ideas, conspiracy and weird things and this and that, and it's flabbergasting of the stuff that people believe. But you see, just because you believe something, that doesn't mean that it's true, and it doesn't mean that it's helpful. And it doesn't mean that it's not a colossal, abominable waste of time. And I waste my time listening to it. And that is not what is important. What is important is much more subtle. It's much more translucent and transparent. Why? Because it is the divine truth that penetrates everything, that even penetrates the hardest and stupidest head, at least to some extent. And that's a pretty big word and a very ubiquitous one. So that is what we have to do, is to encourage the coming forth of that which is already deeply within, and which occasionally manifests to us, to come forth and go increasingly into our lives, into our actions, into what we need to do and need to be in our lives. And once again, I don't mean that such an effort has to be spectacularly and dramatically successful, by the way. No. Even if it works just a little bit, then you are that much ahead. It works that much better than it did before. and it will work more and it will work better. So let us try to keep that in mind. Let's have sort of our own Corpus Christi procession. Have the indwelling Christ be carried by our consciousness into our outer lives, into everything. You know, there is a lot of precedent for that sort of thing. For instance, there was a saint, I think he was canonized, named Brother Lawrence. And he was a humble lay brother in a monastery. You know, lay brothers are the ones who are monastics, but they are not priests and they are not in holy orders. And so his particular job was to work in the kitchen. And he had, he is the one who created the concept of the practice of the presence of God. And he felt that he could practice that presence, say, when he was in the kitchen cleaning fish, which is at best an odoriferous activity. Now, you know, eating the prepared fish is something else. But let's say, whatever he was doing, he was able to bring that focus of the divine focus into his activities. And to some extent and degree, I think we all can do that. And if we try to do it, then it will happen. And we will be certainly very much the better off for it. And perhaps our associates will also be the better off for it, because we will be better and more understanding and wiser and more compassionate people than we have been before, which is certainly a very, very helpful and very important condition toward which to move. And maybe the being in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament in procession and of the festival of Corpus Christi may be a helpful agency, an agency helpful to us in that endeavor. And that certainly is a hope, and we think that therefore celebrating this festival may then redound to our abiding benefit. And so may the mystery of that which hangs twixt heaven and earth descend upon us and remain with us always. Amen.